I am excited to present Jon Erickson. He is the Blittersdorf Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources and a fellow of the Gund Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont. He's published widely on climate change policy, renewable energy economics, environmental management, and the theory and practice of ecological economics. I have posted a number of links on the resource section of this session page if you want to read a bit of that writing. He's led international research and education programs as a Fulbright Scholar in Tanzania and visiting professor in the Dominican Republic, Iceland, and Slovakia. He has also produced Emmy Award-winning documentary films on water, energy, and food system transitions, and founded and led numerous nonprofit organizations, including the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics, Adirondack Research Consortium, Deportes para la Vida, and Bright Blue Ecomedia. So, pretty impressive. Jon is one of the professors that I am fortunate enough to learn from and work with in my program. I have my PhD program. I'm not sure he would describe himself this way, but from my perspective as a new ecological economist, he's one of the early leaders in ecological economics in North America who laid critical institutional groundwork for the research I and many others who are arriving at ecological and systems thinking are able to do. It's also pretty inspiring the ways in which he effectively brings ecological perspectives into policy space, whether it's as an economic advisor, working on the Green New Deal with Bernie Sanders, or in co-developing Vermont's Genuine Progress Indicator as an alternative to GDP. And today he's going to talk about what we've been touching on in so much of our discussions, which is how to approach our economy from a perspective of justice, well-being, and ecology, and how to determine the right size of that economy. And as Barb mentioned before, how leaving behind economic growth as a big social and political goal is perhaps not as impossible as it sometimes seems. So I am going to stop talking now and listen, and thank you for being here, and Jon, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. So here is Jon Erickson with a just transition to a right-sized economy.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you all for having me. Can you hear me okay? Good. All right, hopefully the wind has all of a sudden died down, so that's good. So I can stay outside. So yeah, let me share my slides here before I get going. Yeah, the title of this long talk is a little bit scary when you ask an academic to give a long talk. It could be hours and hours and hours, but I will try to keep it short, so we have some time for discussion. And I'd like to try to use the chat box along the way too. So please, if you don't know where the chat button is, it's down at the bottom, and we might use that a few times depending on how time is going. Speaking of time, let me get a check here. So as Sean said, one of the big themes in ecological economics, when you really take ecology seriously, ethics seriously, is how do you know, what's the right size of the economy? We mostly focus in mainstream economics on what is an efficient economy, and rarely ask the question, how big should the economy be, not how efficient should it operate? And if we are going to move away from a growth-oriented economy, or growth as the ultimate goal of the economy, how do we do that in a way that's just? How do we do that in a way that really creates a new economic model built more on distributive justice instead of on efficient, forever growing economic system? So that's what I thought I'd talk about today. And I've got three main parts to the talk. Just some grounding in mental models, how traditionally we've thought about the economy, and this, what would a move towards thinking about right sizing the economy look like. Then a brief discussion of different pathways. We'll discuss three different pathways towards this just transition to a right-sized economy. And then I'll have less time on strategies, because I do want to have the breakout groups and have you all spend some time on strategies, and then we can circle back and have a longer conversation about strategies towards a just transition to a right-sized economy, because I think it's going to vary by locality and by people and place, but we can certainly plant some seeds. So if I were with you in person, I might start with a blank page. We might start with a whiteboard, or if we were taking a long walk in the woods together, we might just find a bare piece of ground and a stick to draw some sketches. And I might first draw a square. And this is where we often start in an introductory economics class. 1 million plus students in North America are taking Intro to Econ 101 every semester. And, they start with a box and call it the economy. And inside that box are households and firms. And households in a capitalistic economy own the land, the labor, the capital, and in return get paid rent, wages, and interest on those three things. And households in a capitalist economy then take those earnings and give it back to firms, and firms in return give goods and services. And this is what's known as the circular flow diagram. The goal of this economy and an Econ 101 class is to grow. Some graphics from the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. And you can see that this model, as it's been conceived, this mental model has grown real GDP, so GDP adjusted for inflation, gross domestic product, the metric that I would say every single national economy on earth uses to guide economic policy, has grown. And it's grown to a level of about worldwide, about $90 trillion today. 75% of that real GDP is in only 15 countries. 40% of it is in 2 countries, the US and China. And as that GDP has grown, it has tracked population. Population is perhaps 7.8 billion people today. If you were born in 2011, by your 12th birthday, in 2011, we had about 7 billion people. By your 12th birthday, there'll be 8 billion. So population is growing. 40% of the population of the world is in 3 countries, China, India, and the US. 75% is in 27 countries, whereas 75% of the economy is in 15 countries. Foreign direct investment is another way to think about this growing system. It grew many thousand folds over time as the world has become globalized and connected, and as trade flows, but more important, capital flows, investment flows, finances flows, money flows across border. That's been a part of this economic circular flow diagram. And the urban population has grown. We are an urbanizing world. The world hit the 50% mark in 2013, 2014. 50% of the world's population is in urban environments. In the US, it's more like 80%. I don't know what the statistic is for Canada. And we're on track to be 2/3 urban by the year 2050. So my first question for you is what's missing, right? We've got this circular flow conception of how the economy works, and we've got a goal of the economy to kind of support these hockey stick diagrams, an ever-growing economy to support an ever-growing population. So I'd love for you to use the chat box and just briefly answer my question. What's wrong with this picture? You still see my slides? Or did they come off? No, okay.
Oh, actually, no, we're not seeing the slides anymore, I don't think.
Okay,
No.
well, that's
No, we're not seeing slides anymore, John, and we're also getting some wind noise.
oh, my apologies. I'll turn the microphone a bit away from the wind. How's that?
That sounds okay for now.
Is it better yet?
Thank you. I'm not able to see the chat as I talk, but now I bounced out so I can see it. So what's wrong with this picture? Give me some thoughts in the chat box. What's missing? What's wrong with it? What do you like about it? What's good about it? the circular flow diagram, GDP as a metric of the success of that system, description of that system as I've laid it out, and I've claimed this is a Econ 101 picture to 1 million plus young people every year in our universities alone. So Katie Kish says missing social well-being. That's a good start. Other thoughts? What's wrong with the picture? Missing everything. Money doesn't count, okay? Great point, Sean. Everything is monetized in this picture, right? Land, labor, and capital. Other thoughts? It's a shy group. What's missing in this picture? Trees are missing. Well, they're a sector of the economy, right? The environment is somehow inside the economy. There's a forestry sector, there's a mining sector, there's an energy sector. Finite resources, okay? So yeah, this square at first glance seems to have no boundary conditions, right? It's just sort of floating there in space. And that's something that ecological economics have been keen to point out. That is, the square floats in space. That might not be an accurate picture of the world, or maybe a dangerous starting point, talking about the economic system. So let me jump back to my pictures. Okay, so yeah, I'd say all those things are missing, and one of the big conclusions of ecological economics, what I've spent more or less my whole career on, is simply saying that the box needs to go inside of a circle, right? We need to embed the economy inside of social systems, cultural systems. We need to embed our social systems inside of ecosystems, at the very least, the global ecosystem. Because this economy has a social system with social goals and social well-being as higher level goals, right? The economy should be our servant, not our master. And this is indeed embedded in an ecosystem. And this very, 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 very simple starting point in ecological economics has dramatic for both the goal, operation, and policy. This ecosystem, of course, is fed by the ultimate finite resource, sunshine, and it kicks heat out in the process. And it's fed by matter and energy on the one side and matter and energy out the other. So where we often start in ecological economics is to recognize the economic system as a subsystem, but embedded in a social system, embedded in an ecosystem, and run by, we often lean on the laws of thermodynamics, right? Run by low entropy matter and energy. So in economic terms, low entropy means high organization or high usefulness, high order. And always and everywhere, the economic system consumes, accelerates, uses low entropy matter energy, and produces, as a consequence, all the accumulated things inside the blue box, but also produces high entropy, less ordered, less useful matter and energy out the other side in a purely kind of physical sense. And as this real GDP hockey stick goes up and up and up, so does primary energy use. So does things like fertilizer consumption. So does things like water use. This hockey stick has been supported by other hockey sticks, right? Around energy and matter. And as this hockey stick has gone up and up and up, so does the waste side of the box with carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, ocean acidification. And these graphics are only up to the year 2010. So folks have called this period since 1950 the Great Acceleration. My parents were born in 1943 and 1944, are both alive and well, and during their lifetimes they've experienced the kind of shovel of this hockey stick. Global debt to support this is another theme. We'll hit $184 trillion for a $90 trillion economy in 2017. Just during my lifetime, I was born in 1969. Global population has doubled. The global economy has quadrupled. Global trade has grown by 10 times. Yet we've lost during my lifetime half of all wild animals. During my lifetime, we've seen the most acceleration of the CO2 part of this hockey stick, the carbon dioxide graph. Just since 1990, and I can't stress this enough, just since 1990, over half of CO2 from industrialization has been emitted into the atmosphere. So this great acceleration is a phenomenon not just since 1950, but a phenomena in more recent times. So that's a bit about models. I want to talk now about pathways, different ways of thinking about if you believe that this show, these hockey sticks can't last forever, that it's both biophysically impossible, but also socially morally undesirable, what might different pathways look like? So I've made the case that we, at the very least, need to embed the square inside of circles, maybe different layers of circles. And one strategy might be blind growth, right? One strategy might say, you know, just let the market do its thing. Let growth be growth. If people want a cleaner environment, if people want less CO2, they'll demand it. If they want a stable climate, if they want more wild animals, they'll demand it. And that this economic system itself can self-correct when it hits limits. And limits indeed are a relative thing, not an absolute thing, right? Limits are relative to something else, and that we can substitute away from constraints, and we can use technology, we can become more efficient. And so one strategy is just sort of business as usual, right? Blind growth. And under blind growth, maybe we're not so worried about these boundary conditions. Maybe under blind growth, we are expanding as an urbanizing population into the non-human world, and it is what it is, to quote someone recently. The sort of for and against strategies of blind growth. The for is that we still live in an empty world, to borrow some phrasing from Herman Daly, right? That there's still more frontier to conquer, still more land and people to colonize, that we have plenty of space. And indeed, half of the world's population lives in urban environments that take up perhaps 6 or 7% of the world's space. So under that argument, we've got lots of room for growth. Whereas the against argument would say these hockey sticks are warnings, right? There comes the wind again. Tell me if it gets too bad and I'll go inside. That we indeed live in a full world, that the fullness of our presence, of one species domination, and indeed our species has begun to kind of name this world after ourselves, right? The Anthropocene, the human-dominated geological epoch. So, you know, the empty world, if you look at the Earth at night, wow, look at all that space. Look at all that room for growth. Look at sub-Saharan Africa. Look at Brazil. Look at the northern parts of North America and Canada. There's so much room for more light, more presence of the human species. If you zoom into the United States and Canada, southern Canada and northern Mexico, again, this is sort of a reflection of where the most people live. There's lots and lots of frontier yet to conquer and colonize under an empty worldview. If you look at the latest land use assessment from the USDA, USDA in this very crude categorization takes 6 land use categories. Each square on this map is about 250,000 acres. So it's designated, it's kind of dominant use within that 250,000 acres. In this conception of land use, urban use is only 3.6% of the lower 48 states in the US, where 4 out of 5 Americans live, 3.6% of the land. And that urban use has more than quadrupled since 1945. And urban acres, 1 million new urban acres are added per year, urban-suburban use. It's the fastest growing category in this map. if you take all those squares and rearrange them and start naming things, you can see that much of the land is for cow pasture and range, including range more broadly for sheep, goats, horses, and farmsteads. Livestock feed is here, so the land that's used to feed, in addition to the grasslands, the food we eat. One of the other fastest growing land uses in the United States is this here that's categorized as the state of Florida. So all of the 100 largest landowning families own about that much land. And that's one of the fastest growing land use categories in the US. Let's see, since 2008, the 100 largest landowners went from 28 to 40 million. Since 2008, 12 years, went from 28 million acres to 40 million acres. So how we allocate land and how we use land is about all of these kinds of uses. And the empty world vision would say, look, like this ad from Alabama Power, their motto is always on. And the thing at the bottom here says, with electricity prices at least 15% below the national average, why not, right? So it's part of the emancipation project, if you will, to continue to light up the earth in an empty world view. So those are two contrasts. The other contrast is a rising tide lifts all boats. So let blind growth do its thing, and growth benefits everybody. The nth side might be wealth begets wealth, right? That what we see is growth, but in a highly uneven way. We see these, what we call positive feedback loops, right? Where wealth creates more wealth, and we see a growing divergence between rich and poor people and rich and poor countries. So zooming in on the US, where I do much of my work in recent years, you can look at this graph from Tim Jackson's assessment. This is a graph of post-tax income growth in the US by percentile from 1946 to 2014. The blue dots is the average annual growth rate for each of these percentiles, 1%, 2%, 3%, just from 1946 to 1980. 1980-81 was the year we flipped the switch and we went to a completely different growth model where the rising tide no longer lifts all boats, or at least not in an absolute way. The red dots are 1980 to 2014. So post-war to World War II growth up to 1980 was growth from the bottom up. Since the Reagan-Thatcher era, it's been growth from the top down, especially here. You carve out the top 0.001%, they've seen the most real average annual growth. Higher incomes equal higher demand for the environment. That's often a case for blind growth, right? That you have to become wealthier, you have to hit a higher income status before you can afford to protect the environment, to care about the environment. You have that the environment is somehow a luxury good instead of a basic needs good. Versus higher incomes equal higher demands on other environments, where we see richer countries are able to import stuff that was previously pollution intensive, labor intensive, resource intensive from elsewhere, and then claim that their growth is getting greener and greener and greener. This is a topic that I want to explore a little bit more with you here in a minute, but if you look at some of Jason Hickel and Georgios Kallis's work, this great article that came out last year called Is Green Growth Possible? They summarized a lot of data, including the global material footprint from 1970 to 2013. So this is metal ores, fossil fuels, non-metallic minerals, biomass, and up, and away it goes. And it tracks quite nicely with GDP, right? So that as we've grown, that box has expanded into the circle. And as we've grown even more efficiently, we've actually found cheaper and faster, more efficient ways to plunder the earth. As we've grown inequitably, we've also seen that the highest income lifestyles, there's plenty of evidence to show, have the highest environmental impacts. So this is a study on US households year, and it shows this sort of pattern, right? That as you get into the richer and richer classes of households, not only are you producing more CO2 in your diets, in your housing choices, in your fashion, your clothing, your transportation choices, but also as you consume more of the service sector, the so-called low CO2 parts of the economy, you're also having higher and higher levels of CO2 per household. So the last for and against under blind growth is the for argument is often that income weighted consumption equals progress, right? That's GDP, gross domestic product. Take all the things that we produce and consume within a year, weight it by its price, and that becomes kind of the thumbnail sketch of progress. Versus the argument that we often make in ecological economics that income, production, consumption has diminishing returns, and we can get into a zone which what Herman Daly calls uneconomic growth, where the next unit of growth creates more costs than benefits. So we've been doing some work in the ecological economics community of alternative ways of framing GDP, taking GDP and adjusting it, typically adjusted for 25 different costs and benefits: environmental costs, social benefits, environmental benefits. And we get this indicator called the genuine progress indicator. And this expansive literature now, and the GPI results have been done now in over 17 different countries, all 50 states in the US, been done both in Canada and the US, different provinces in Canada. Generally, the conclusion has been progress as measured by actually counting costs and benefits of a growing economy peaked in the late 1970s and has been flat or in decline ever since. This was a study recently by a former grad student at UVM, Aida Kubishevsky, where she pulled together all of the global studies and came up with a similar kind of measurement of progress for the global economy. And it also has peaked in her study in 1976. So this idea of a progress recession has been an important part of the ecological economics dialogue. On GDP's terms, in monetary values, is GDP even an honest assessment of growing material progress if you actually go through the exercise and count a benefit as a benefit and a cost as a cost. We've been doing, Sean mentioned this work in Vermont for some time. We actually passed GPI into the law here in Vermont, and it has to be used as a metric to gauge our progress against other traditional metrics like gross state product, like employment, like incomes. And we've also seen here in Vermont this growing gap between a growing economy and so-called genuine progress. Whew. So the strategy number 2 is green growth. And I want to unpack this one a little bit because this gets a lot of attention in that kind of sustainable development world. Let me just stop my share and bounce up out here for a second so I can see people and comments. Wind is strong at 12:23. Okay, well, the wind's down again. Can you hear me okay? Sean, I can see your face. Thumbs up? Okay. It's hard when I can only see my slides. So when I do the screen share of my slides, I can't see you all. It's just like I'm talking to myself like a crazy person.
We're here.
Okay, good. Good. How are we doing on time? 12:34. All right. So let me try a second strategy on you, the green growth strategy, and then that'll give us to a second pathway, and then that'll help us pivot to the strategy conversation about what might it just transition to a right-sized economy look like. Okay, so same diagram, box inside the circle, which is where we like to start. And a lot of attention has been given to green growth, right? That we can continue to grow, but in more efficient ways. We can continue to grow in less impactful ways. We can become more efficient through technology, through education, through better choices, and continue to hang on to the dream of a growing economy inside a fixed, limited planetary ecosphere, but do it in a way that through efficiency, we can kind of keep the party going, keep on growing. grow, baby, grow. So this, this looks something like this, my fancy graphics, right? So we keep the box the same size and we continue to grow household consumption, firm consumption, the loops get bigger, the circular flow diagram keeps moving. We don't have to rewrite our textbooks, right? We don't have to redo teaching Econ 101. We just double down on the efficiency narrative. So in fact, this is a narrative that has been largely adopted by the UN community, the United Nations Environmental Program, the United Nations Development Program, the Kyoto Protocol, now the Paris Accord, the IPCC scenarios, the 116 scenarios that keep us within a 2 degrees Celsius envelope, all assume green growth, that we continue to grow between 2 and 3% per year as a global economy and do it in a very efficient way. So they sort of all assume this idea that human well-being continues to increase exponentially, economic activity continues to increase exponentially, although there's some decoupling here. Well-being advances beyond GDP. If you believe the GPI literature that I just showed you, that has not been the case. But we do this in a resource decoupling way. Hold on, let me let my whining dog in. Loki. Oh, the joys of working from home. Okay, I'm back. And most importantly, we decouple from the impact, right? So we have real CO2 limits to meet these 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius thresholds, which means there's only so much carbon left to burn within a very short period of time. So we have to quickly decouple, not relatively speaking, but absolutely speaking, right? Turn the environmental curve here the opposite way. So this is called green growth. Is it possible? Is it impossible? And there's a huge growing literature on exactly this question. On the possible side, right, the argument is that, look at the evidence, empirically, we're more efficient, and it's true. At the unit level, at the margin, which is where economists love to live, right? At the next unit, right? The amount of material, the amount of energy that's used for that next unit of growth over time has become less and less and less pollution, less and less and less material. However, the climate doesn't care if growth at the margin is more efficient. What the climate cares about is what's the total impact of that growth. And so what we also find empirically is, as the cost per unit has declined, it's cheaper to do more, it's cheaper to produce more, it's cheaper to consume more. So guess what we do? We do more. And so the aggregate impact maybe slightly decouples, but in no way, shape, or form absolutely decouples. So I'm leaning again on Giorgio Callas's work, who's an active scholar in the degrowth literature. In his article, Radical Dematerialization and Degrowth, really kind of looks at the fact that material intensity, right, kilograms of stuff per dollar, this lower graph has been going down. Although there's some recent evidence because of high material, high energy lifestyles that it's on the upswing again. But material extraction has not gone down. We've become more efficient, so therefore we use more stuff. And it tracks with GDP quite well. The other argument of green growth is that through technology, we can find substitutes, right? As things grow scarce, we'll substitute one thing for another. The argument in ecological economics, though, is that low entropy matter energy, these two little arrows right here, always and everywhere are complements, right? You can become the most efficient cook in the world and create the most efficient oven. In fact, that's my next slide. The classic pizza example from Econ 101, right? We can become more labor efficient, more capital efficient, more energy efficient, but you can't ultimately substitute away the need for more cheese, more pepperoni, more dough, and more fuel for the fire. These things, low entropy, matter energy, are always and everywhere complements. The challenge is, as we've depleted these low entry resources, it's requiring more and more energy to keep the depletion party going. So here's a graph that I put up for you all in Canada from Tim Jackson's work, energy return, energy invested for Canada 1945 to 2009. So this says on the horizontal axis, what's the energy return, right? How many units of energy did you have to expend to get energy back, right? And Canada, much like the rest of the world, climbed that EROI ladder through the 50s, through the 60s, through the 70s, through technology, through exploration, through capital investment. We were able to get to higher and higher energy return resources. But those curves across the world have gone down, and then technology has helped with a little bit of rebound, and then they've gone down again. So we've gone on average, the global oil imports in 1990 were as much as 40 to 1 on energy return, 1 unit of energy in, 40 units out. They've gone down and down and down. By 2007, they were closer to 15 to 1. You also see in this graph, as we've substituted away from fossil fuels toward renewables, these renewables like photovoltaics, like ethanol sugarcane, like biodiesel, these get really, really close to 1 to 1. 1 unit of energy in, the 1 unit out. We are going to need more energy to produce on this kind of growth parade that we're on. This is a much longer story. It's something that many of our PhD students in our 2 projects are actively engaged with. Oh man, the bald eagle is hovering above my head right now. I'm sorry, I'm really distracted. Give me just a second here. I never grow tired of seeing. Hold on, I got my binoculars, hold on. Sorry. Okay. Green growth. We can also grow and have the box not grow and continue to grow GDP through structural change, right? Structural change becoming less of an industrial economy, more of a service sector economy. Versus that shift, the impossible part of it is that as we become a more of a service sector economy, we move into higher and higher energy lifestyles. So what's the evidence show there? Yes, an economy like the US is becoming much more of a service sector economy. Let's see here, the US is at 77% now, roughly, as a percent of our GDP is from the service sector. The world is around 69%, so the world has moved into more of a service sector world. However, just taking the US as a whole, I won't unpack this next diagram, but these are my favorite diagrams. These Sankey diagrams shows all the flows of energy use across our economy. We are consuming more energy than we ever had, yet we are a bigger service sector economy than we ever have, right? So the box continues to expand despite the structural shift. And much of that has to do with higher and higher and higher energy lifestyles. That other graph that I showed you, the wealthier we become, the more high energy choices that we make in our driving and our flying and in our consumption. So green growth isn't looking so promising here. The other possible impossible dichotomy is cost shifting, right? It is possible to grow green if you shift your costs elsewhere. And this is largely what countries like the United States have done, right? We've told a story of more efficient growth, of less greenhouse gases per unit of growth, because we don't count for the greenhouse gases of our total consumption, right? We import so much from China and from Canada, yet we don't count those CO2 emissions. They are allocated to Canada and China. Yet if you track CO2 emissions to our consumption instead of our production, the green growth myth is burst yet again. So again, Hickel and Callis have done some great work on sort of looking at territorial versus consumption emissions. And the moral of the story is that CO2 emissions continue to go up as the economy becomes more efficient. Again, the green growth myth isn't panning out. So I do want to get into the strategies for you all, because the third model is a sustainable scale model. So the sustainable scale says that instead of this, we want to go and right size the economy. We want to create a box inside a circle, but at the right size that can sustain itself for a very long time. So this may mean right sizing downwards instead of upwards. But sustainable scale with just distribution in mind, right? With just distribution as the main strategy to achieve sustainability. That we downsize through distribution, that we downsize through a more fair, equitable allocation. That curve of the US households going way out at the other end, we downsize in this sort of a race to the middle, both within countries and between countries. So this is the theme. Just transition, took me a while to get there, sorry. Just transition to a right-sized economy, right? How do we do this? How do we go this direction within a framework of justice and within a long-term goal of achieving a sustainable scale? What might that look like? Well, I often answer this question in one of two ways. We'll either do this by default or by design. We'll either crash into limits and have to downsize. So much of this is what's happening right now with the global pandemic. We're downsizing, not necessarily or we'll do it by choice, by design, and do it in a fair, just way. For example, that maintains full employment, that shares work more equitably, more justly, that shares our use of the commons more equitably and justly. What would that look like? By default, this is the theme of this Tim Jackson article that I'm leaning on called the Post-Growth Challenge. So Tim and others are saying that through secular stagnation, through inequality, through limits to growth, the world is already slowing down. So this is the growth rate of the Rich Country Club, OECD, GDP per capita, 1966 to 2016. And you can see this kind of moving average, right? Of the good old days where the 2, 3, 4% growth rates, but more recently it's more like 1 to 1.5, maybe below 1% annual growth rates. The other part of this is that while we've moved to lower and lower qualities in terms of that energy return metric, while we've had to use more energy to find and exploit and produce more energy, that's taken more and more and more of our GDP effort. And in order to grow on a path of declining energy quality, we have done that through borrowing more and more money. So this graph showing total domestic outstanding credit versus US GDP is something we can look at globally, but the US certainly stands out in terms of the global ratio is about 1 to 2. So 1 unit of output, 2 units of debt. US ratio is more like 1 to 3.5. Another part of the sort of by default is that this social limit to growth of when will workers say enough is enough? When will workers say that productivity continues to go up, yet wage rates have been flat when you account for inflation? So the capture of the effort of the labor that has gone to the profits interest side of the GDP equation and away from the wage and earnings side ends up being a pretty significant social limit to growth that we're seeing around the world. A lot of folks have been talking instead about right sizing by design. Tim's work on prosperity without growth here in Vermont, our writer-in-chief, Bill McKibben, wrote a beautiful book more at the community scale on deep economy. Peter Victor, emeritus professor from York University in Toronto, Managing Without Growth, doing some very interesting modeling where he's modeled the Canadian economy and asked the question, can we degrow, can we get to a smaller size economy yet maintain full employment, right? That's been one of the boundary conditions of his work. Juliet Shore's work on true wealth, professor at Boston University, really looking at questions of work and time allocation, and where does wealth actually come from. And then more recently, Kate Raworth's work, which has gotten a lot of attention around the world, her framing of the donut economics, where we sort of try to create a new model that gets everyone to a minimum level of life, of well-being, but within the limits imposed by things like biodiversity loss, CO2 emissions, use of materials, water, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the popular framing from Kate Raworth now that has really starting to make a pretty big influence in that kind of international development conversation. How do we maintain these social foundations and yet stay within ecological ceilings? And her framing is the safe and just space for humanity. This work has been done now, is being downscaled from kind of planetary ecological ceiling to national and even city level. Dan O'Neill, some colleagues at Leeds University in the UK, took the donut framing and asked this question: can you hit that minimum? Can you hit the inside of the donut, what he's calling a good life, and stay within planetary boundaries? And the moral of the story was, under the current growth capitalist model, no. So these are countries that circle sizes by population. And you can see that every country, as it's achieved its social thresholds and gone from the lower left part of the graphic to the upper right part of the graphic, has done so by blowing past its share of the globe's biophysical boundaries. So the task of this research project was to find one country up here in the top left corner, and the closest was Vietnam. One country in the top left corner. So we've used some of this work with NGOs here in Vermont. It's a framing that is very intuitive to a lot of folks working in this space, to take the US graph, which is the same story. We've achieved all but 2 of the social thresholds in the donut framework and blown past all of the biophysical thresholds. And we've started to ask this question for the state of Vermont. What is Vermont's donut? What would that look like? Can we sort of frame the development conversation as a next step away from this monetized conversation that we've used with GPI towards this question of a safe and fair space? So that brings me to strategies. A few thoughts, and then we can do our, well, I'll leave it up to you all. We can take our break, or we can move into, I think you wanted to have some follow-up conversation questions for me first, and then we can move into our break and then have our breakouts. So the question is, what are the strategies? If you believe the evidence that I've shown you that line growth isn't doing it, green growth isn't doing it, maybe we need to move to a whole new conception that isn't so growth-based, right? That is actually has to do with the right size of the economy within a justice framework. So I've been leaning on Callis, so I will again. You know, he defines this sort of right sizing by design challenge of ours as a smooth economic downscaling to a sustainable future where we can live better with less. So that's as good a place as any to start. What would a smooth economic downscaling to a sustainable future look like where we can live better with less? And I certainly have heard lots of stories from privileged folks like myself who haven't lost their jobs, who haven't had their incomes cut, but have had dramatic changes in lifestyles and use of our time, as feeling like, wow, this pandemic living is quite different, quite new. And is it an opportunity to really question whether we want to go back to so-called normal when the world was already in crisis? So the kinds of things we talk about in our leadership for the Ecozoic project, the the kinds of things we've talked about in the preceding project, Economics for the Anthropocene. We've got 40 plus PhD students in these two programs, another dozen or so master's students, asking some version of this question, some more focused on the downscaling piece or the economic piece, other on the lifestyle piece, some more focused on the psychological, anthropological, sociological elements, others focused on the financial economic elements or the biophysical elements. But one of the things that we look at is work sharing to redistribute those gains from productivity. So if you remember that graph for the US, labor productivity is up, 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 up and away, although it's growing now at a decreasing rate, yet wages have been flat. Progressive taxes on capital and off of labor to reconnect those wages to productivity. The reason that that graph, productivity and wages track well in the United States from the 1940s all the way through the 1970s is because of progressive taxation. When the Reagan-Thatcher era came in and the tax load was taken off of capital and put relatively more on labor, that disconnected wages from productivity. Tax shifting to disincentivize resource-intensive consumption is another big part of the right sizing by design question. We've done a lot of work here in Vermont. I'm thinking about redoing our taxation system, moving more of the tax base on resource-intensive consumption, for example, on CO2 emissions, and then using those funds to help address the more regressive impacts of taxing consumption. Reforming the monetary system to reduce the growth bias. This is each of these is a whole nother talk, so I apologize. I'm just laying out some different ideas. A number of folks in our two projects have thought a lot about monetary system reform, money reform more largely, trying to understand the growth bias or lack thereof, or in our financial systems, trying to understand that relationship between macroeconomic policy and the ultimate microeconomic outcomes. My own work has been thinking more at bioregional scales, community, but watershed scales, biosphere scales, thinking across landscapes and not being constrained by town or county or state or national boundaries. So in this sense, moving into a space of more comprehensive planning, regional planning, thinking about how do we coordinate activities, for example, within watersheds, within food sheds. I'm working with a PhD student, well, he's just finished his PhD on energy shed planning, really using the notion of an energy shed to connect producers and consumers of energy, but at scale. That's a way to be thinking about right sizing. Recirculating income. So we often use the metaphor of the bucket. A community is like a bucket, and the bucket's got lots of leaks in it. Like a big one is energy expenditure. Most communities don't make the energy that they consume. And so the money that's spent on energy immediately leaves their local economies. But very simple strategies, for example, of home weatherization, become right-sizing strategies because you're plugging that leak. That income is now available to recirculate in the local economy. Of course, it can be used on vacations to Disney World, but the question is how do we capture more of that income locally? How do we shorten the supply chains? And I think that's a really interesting area that's been opened up due to the pandemic. Common asset trusts, really thinking about our land, water, and air as trusts, changing our relationships with our land, water, and air, having citizen boards that manage or steward land, water, and air, instead of the opposite that's happened under capitalism is the privatization of common assets, rapid privatization, especially in recent years. Non-market networks and income. I saw Katie Kish was on the call. I think she's maybe still with us, but on the call earlier. This has been the basis of a lot of her work on care economies, maker economies. Again, this is a huge opening under the current pandemic, as we've seen here in Vermont early in the pandemic when food supplies were stretched very thin because of the reliance on global supply chains. We saw an immediate pivot to neighborhood approaches to food sheds. We saw an immediate pivot to care maker economies to fill the need for, what's the acronym, PPE, personal protection equipment. So is there an opportunity kind of post-pandemic as we rethink, redesign, rebuild the economy in a way that really leans into these non-market networks and income? Shared ownership models is another whole space that we could talk for hours about. Vermont leads the country in employee-owned companies. And to me, it's all about shortening the distance between cause and effect. So if I own something, if I own the company that I work for, I make different decisions about the investment and how I treat my employees and how I connect with my community. It's more of an embedded model versus if I just own a share in a company that's traded on Wall Street and I'm completely disconnected from the cause and effect of my investment decision. You get what you get, right? You get an economic system that is completely unleashed from any sense of shared moral responsibility. We've been doing a lot of work in recent months on the conception of a New England Green New Deal and a new alliance that's emerged called the Renew New England, which is an alliance of racial, income, environmental justice groups. And we're sort of at the point where asking the question, how can we do Green New Deal type strategies that don't depend on Washington, D.C.? How do we keep more of this income local? How do we use things like state banks, state bonds, community bonds, local retirement pooling? How do we change laws so that folks like myself, I have my retirement income at UVM, but I'm only given a limited choice of where I can invest that, and it's all in Wall Street. So I choose to keep it in cash, borrow against it, and put it into land, but that's another story. But how could I have the option for to invest my University of Vermont retirement in my own community or in my state? So each of those strategies is a talk in and of itself, and I know Sean has talked some of those strategies already. You'll probably hear from future speakers that take a deeper dive into those strategies. But as an ecological economist, I think first and foremost about what our mental model is and how do we change that. That then opens the space for different kinds of pathways, not just more of the same, like green growth, more efficient growth, but really rethinking the growth priority altogether. And that really, like the degrowth community that many of us walk in, opens up some very creative spaces for thinking about livelihoods and well-being in ways that don't depend upon this growth machine. So, just about 1 o'clock, great. That's all I've got to say about that. Stop sharing my screen and kick it back to you, Sean,
Right.
maybe, or I'm not sure, no, sorry.
Hi, I'll jump in. For those who have joined after the beginning, I'm Barb Lindenberg, part of Long Talks in the Woods with Marilyn Zare and Sean Sellers. We're all here. I'm facilitating the session here, and thank you, John. So right now, I'm just going to open the floor in a sec for some clarifying questions, and then we'll take a short break before bigger discussion. So clarifying question is just something that helps you to make sure you've understood the contents of the presentation. It's not like a bigger discussion question. So like, for example, can you briefly explain the difference between material intensity and material consumption, or whatever that was in the graph that I didn't quite understand. So that's an example of like a clarifying question, rather than something a little bit bigger that requires more discussion. We can save those for after the break, so everyone has a chance to get some water and go to the bathroom before we dive in. So let's see, if there are clarifying questions, go ahead and raise your hands. I'll try to go to gallery view and keep an eye on you all. And then you can use the chat box as well. Okay, I'm seeing no hands up. All right, as there's nothing in the chat box here, then why don't we just take a quick break? Sound good? Oh wait, Donna, did you have a question or are you saying yes to a break? Yes to a break. Okay, so we will take, usually we take a 7-minute break and it is 1:05. So come back to us at 1:12 and we'll jump into some discussion. If there are many people for the discussion time who are still hanging around and wanting to talk, then we will do breakout groups. And if we have one big group, that's fine too. So see you soon. Tara, that's an amazing background. Tara's got her hand up. Her hands, all of them. I can't hear you.
And I have one of these. This is what I have.
Okay.
And then, well, yeah.
Wow.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. It's been busy, but glad to have made most of this. I had to be in the car for part of it. So I
Okay.
look forward to looking at the slides later.
Yeah. They'll be up. Now, Marilyn, is Marilyn back yet? No. Okay, we'll have to stop the recording.
And I see my friend Anne is here. Great.